Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Hello students, welcome back, and it's wonderful to meet you again for this course on literary criticism that you're going to do as a part of your MA. It is wonderful to again talk to you about this general introduction that we are going to do to literary criticism. Now, what we're going to do today, the plan for today is that we are going to have a look at what do we understand by literary criticism, what does literary criticism do, and how does it relate itself to literature, and how do you relate literature and criticism together. So this is how we are going to look at literary criticism. What are the issues, for example, in literary criticism? How do we understand literary criticism as a part of a historical perspective? How do we understand literary criticism as a kind of a historical continuum? Because we know that the history of literary criticism is quite an old one. So it starts from very early times and it continues even today. So it's important to understand and look it within a certain context. And then, of course, during the course, you're going to look at specific literary critics and then study them. But I hope that this overview that you have on literary criticism will help you to understand how Western literary criticism developed over a period of time, because our focus today is on Western literary criticism. So let's look at what are the things that we need to understand before we understand what is literary criticism. Now, the question is, the moment we say that there is something called literature, and throughout this general introduction, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at questions. We are going to try to answer questions. I'm going to give you certain leads. I'm going to try to address certain issues that are there. And so most of the slides that you're going to see for this presentation are going to be slides with question marks. Okay, so there'll be a lot of questions that I'm going to ask. And please keep these questions in mind when you do the entire course, because these are important questions that throughout the history of literary criticism has been asked over a period of time. So when we say that we are doing literary criticism, there are two parts to it. So one is, of course, what do we mean by literature and what do we mean by criticism? And when they come together, we call that literary criticism. So let's look at the first part. When we say that we are dealing with literature, then the question, of course, that arises in our mind is, what do we say is literature, or what do we call literature? So is it only books written by famous writers or major authors? Or do we also consider books that are written by not so famous authors or not so great authors, or not what we call the minor authors? So when we look at literature, when we study literature, and when we do criticism of literature, are we going to focus only on writers who have been successful, writers who have been historically present with us, writers who historically have evolved over a period of time? So when, for example, we look at the history of English literature, there are certain names that keep on coming back to us again and again. So we know that in order to do history of English literature, we need to know the names of Shakespeare, we need to know the name of Milton, we need to know people like Dryden or Pope or Wordsworth or Coleridge or Matthew Arnold, etc., etc. So when we do literary criticism, or when we understand literature, is our understanding of literature only based on these kind of writers? Or do we also look at very minor writers, people who might have written at a certain period of time, but we have forgotten now in the history of English literature? Or we might have neglected them over a period of time. So do we look at all these authors when we do literary criticism? And there is one question that has been in focus in recent times about, what about authors who have not been part of history or mainstream major histories? Why don't we go back to those authors and see what those authors were doing? So these so-called minor authors, not major authors. So we know that what Shakespeare was doing, but we can always go back to Shakespeare. But there are also many other writers at that same point of time who might have written but have not been part of standard histories of literature. So, when we say literature, what do we mean? Do we really mean only the major authors, or do we also look at minor authors when we do criticism? So, this is one question that I think is important to understand what literary criticism is. So, sometimes, and it has often been said till about the 19th or the 20th centuries in the West, literary criticism mostly focused on major authors. They never really looked at other writers who were writing away from the major authors, who were writing different kinds of things, and literary criticism has neglected it. So it's important to therefore go back and see what those minor authors are doing, how are they different, why were they moved out of history, why were they not part of standard histories, etc. And this is a recent development in literary criticism that tends to go back and see what they are doing. Yeah. So this debate between major and minor authors is something that we need to keep in mind when we are looking at literary criticism. The second, of course, is how do we define the literary? So, what is literary? Now, our standard understanding of what we call a literary text or a literary piece of writing is that it must have, let's say, plot. There should be a storyline. The plot can be divided into many parts. So, a plot might have a beginning, it should have a middle, it should have an end. And so, any writing that does not have, let's say, a plot or a beginning, middle, and an end is not to be considered as literary. Okay. Similarly, we also understand that what we call literary generally has characters. So, for example, in a novel or in a play, you will have characters, and characters are important for the consideration of literariness. So, literariness contains within itself ideas like plot and characters. Similarly, we also know that in order to be called literary, you must have setting, you must have events. So you should have a certain storyline, certain things happening within the story, etc., etc. And of course, we can also add the category of complexity. So it should be complex, it should not be a simple story. So if I start a story that there was a king, there is a queen, and they died, then it's not really literary. There has to be certain kind of complication within the story, um, and that complexity makes it literary. Okay. But more interestingly, the question that becomes important when we consider literature is how do we separate the literary from the non-literary? Okay. And I have asked you a question on this. So, do we consider literariness based on the idea of the author? So, do we say because a great writer has written it, therefore it is literary? Or do we say that it doesn't matter whether it's a great author or not a great author? Anything that is written is literary. Okay. Now, there is a very long debate on this. So, what do we consider, or what are the special characteristics of literariness? And what are the characteristics, or what are the characteristics that the non-literary possesses that are different from the literary? So this difference between what we call literary and non-literary is an important aspect of literary criticism. So literary criticism tries to understand the literariness of literature. So what we call literary must have certain aspects to be called literary. And therefore, it brings us to the interesting question that if we know that a play is written by Shakespeare, and if we also know that a note is written by him, let's say it's just a note to a friend, a letter that he wrote to a friend. So, do we say that since it is written by Shakespeare, the play is also literature? And of course, the letter that he writes to his friend is also literature. Okay, we don't have any letters of Shakespeare, but let's assume that there is a letter that people have found signed by William Shakespeare that he had written to a friend. Now, the question is, do we really then understand it as a literary text because it is written by Shakespeare, the letter, Or do we say now the play is a different kind of a literature and the letter is a different kind of literature? Okay. But, or is the letter literature at all? So, do we consider letters, do we criticize or do a critique of letters? Do we include in literary criticism letters of Shakespeare also? By that logic, then let's say if we find a list of items that Shakespeare had made before he went to a market to buy those things, so does that list of items, market items, also can be called literature? And these are some questions that have troubled a lot of literary critics over a period of time. So, how do we say that the literary is something different, let's say from a letter or from a market list, uh, if it is written by the same author? So, how do we distinguish between them? And that is an important aspect of literary criticism. And that is again a question that has been thought about for at least 1,000 years. Uh, the last question that you see on the slide is what is the role of society and history uh, in the construction of the literary? So when we say that when we say that this is literature today, so when we read literature today, we have certain ideas about literature. But let's say about 200 years back, what people read as literature might not be considered as literature today because it might have a completely different standards of judging what was literature. Similarly, 500 years back, it might be again very different in terms of what was literary and what was non literary. So we know that as history changes, as historical changes happen, as social and historical changes happen, the nature of what we call literary also changes. We also know that many popular writers of a certain age, they were very popular at a certain age, but were completely forgotten by history later. People don't talk about them anymore at all, though they were extremely popular, best-selling authors of that period. A lot of people read their books. A lot of people wrote about them. A lot of people, discussed them. They were very popular among the people who used to read literature. But those people, after let's say 100 years, 150 years, have completely been forgotten in textbooks of history, of textbooks of literary history. So when we say that there is something called literature, are we saying that it is universal, it is same across history and society, or does it the nature of literature itself changes over a period of time? And that is something that we need to keep in mind, that when we look at literature or criticism, there is a certain historical and social change that affects it. Or maybe literature and criticism also affect history and society in different ways. So it's a two-way traffic. And therefore, we need to understand that what we are calling literary today may not have been called literary in the previous ages. It might have been called by different names, etc., etc. So that keeping those questions in mind when we talk about literature, we now move on to what we call criticism, because as I told, as I began, literary criticism is a combination of these two things. So let's look at criticism now. So what is literary criticism? Now, one of the most common definitions that you find about literary criticism, of course, is the evaluation and judgment of a literary text. So what you do is you look at a literary text and you evaluate it, you judge it, you talk about the qualities of the text, what are the different kinds of qualities that are there in the text, etc., etc. What is good about the text, what are the best practices in the text, how does the text create meaning. So all these forms of evaluation and judgments become a part of literary criticism. Now, the question that emerges because of this is that, do we evaluate the author? Do we say Shakespeare was a great writer because he did this? Or do we evaluate the text? Do we evaluate just what Shakespeare has written? Now, I'm taking the example of Shakespeare because there are still debates whether there was someone called Shakespeare, whether Shakespeare actually wrote those texts, we now have evidence that many of the texts that were written during that period of time, let's say Elizabethan age, also were collaborations. So a large number of playwrights would get together, or at least two or three playwrights would get together, and they would compose a text together. So many of these texts could have been composed by Shakespeare and Marlowe and Webster together. Yeah? So if it is composed by, let's say, three people, then how do you evaluate it? How do you evaluate the value of the text? That is one question that we need to answer when we are doing literary criticism. Or do we say that no, let's consider the text to have been written by Shakespeare, and let's not move into any other direction at all? So let's evaluate how Shakespeare creates it. Now, the question over here obviously is that does the author create the text, or is the text an independent thing that can be evaluated separately from the author? Many of the early forms of literary criticism, for example, looked at the life of the author and how the life of the author gets reflected in a literary text. Later, of course, in later parts of literary criticism, which we're going to look at briefly later, moves into the text. So they concentrate more on the text rather than on the author. So the author doesn't remain so important in later literary criticism. So this is again something that we need to understand when we understand literary criticism. The third question is the question that I was raising about literature. Much of literary criticism or Western literary criticism is what is there in a text, what is there in a book or a literary book that makes it literary. So what are the literary elements in a book? And that is what literary criticism also looks at. So they try to understand the literariness of a certain text, a literariness of a certain book, etc. In order to understand the literariness of a certain text or a certain book, you also need to understand what is the structure of a text. So how are texts structured? So what is the ideal structure of a text? So if you remember the early writings of the Greek philosopher and literary critic, Aristotle, he talked about tragedy. So he said that tragedy has a certain structure, and then he talked about the structure of a good tragedy, of an ideal tragedy. So the structure of a text becomes important to understand, especially in the history of Western literary criticism. So it's important to understand how a text is structured. So as I said, when I was talking about the plot, you have a beginning, you have a middle, and an end, but then the beginning also can be divided into different parts, the middle can be divided into different parts, the ending can be divided into different parts. And then it was believed that if you follow this structure, then obviously the text is an ideal literary text. These are the elements of literariness in a text. Some amount of literary criticism that started developing later also looks at what are the historical and social conditions that produce a text. So how does history play a role in producing a literary text, or how does society play a role in producing a literary text? This was a later development. It was not very popular in early forms of Western literary criticism, but from 19th century and 20th century onwards, you have an attempt to understand what is historical in a text, what is social in a text, and sometimes what is even autobiographical in a text. How does a writer write? How does the life of a writer kind of influence the way the writer is writing? And these are important questions to ask also in literary criticism. Some of the questions that are also asked and has been a part of literary criticism, at least in the West for a very long time, is what is known as comparing different sorts of literary texts. So what you do is you take one literary text and then you look at other literary texts produced during the same period, almost during the same period, and then you compare them and then try to see which one is better. So that could be one thing that you will be doing. But you can also show how they influence each other. So how an earlier literary text influenced a later literary text, how sometimes literary texts talk to each other, So they keep on influencing and counter influencing each other. And this is again quite a favorite practice of Western literary criticism right from the beginning. So you have a comparative framework. You try to understand literary texts within a certain kind of a comparative framework. Okay. So once we understand these two things, what is literature and what is literary criticism, let's now try to understand what are the questions that literary criticism asks. So what are the basic questions that literary criticism asks in its entire history? Now, one of the very first question that literary criticism begins with in the West is the relationship between a literary text and the reality it represents. Now, what we now understand is for a very long time, literature is seen as a kind of a reflection, as something that represents a reality outside. So there is a reality outside, there is a world outside, and that world needs to be represented. The understanding of literature was that the world that is there outside gets represented in a text. And there has been long debates in the Western literary tradition about how does literature represent reality. So what is the connection between literature, which is written or spoken, and the reality outside? So is it a direct relation that literature completely mirrors or reflects society? Is it a more complex reflection where literature changes, distorts reality? Or is it that literature does not reflect society at all? Literature is completely different from what the world is outside. Literature changes what is there outside, etc. So literature has more of an effect on society rather than literature reflecting society. Yeah? And this is a very long debate in Western literary criticism. So we need to understand that this relationship between reality and the literary text is one of the major streams of debate, discussions in Western literary criticism for almost 1,000 years, and the debate still continues. The second question that literary criticism asks is what is the relationship between the literary text and its author? So, is the literary text completely in control of the author? So, when an author produces a literary text, it is because of this consciousness that the author has, and he's in complete, or he or she is in complete control of what the literary text is all about. So the author completely knows what the literary text is going to do, what the literary text is going to achieve, etc., etc. So there is a purpose, and that purpose in a literary text is always, for a very long time, attributed to the author. So the author wanted to say this, and the task of the literary critic is to find out what the author actually meant to say. So it is a very long tradition. So authorial intention is something that literary criticism should do. There is another group which says that no, it's not the authorial intention. We need to look at what the literary text is trying to do rather than what the author is trying to do. But this, again, as I said, is a very long debate, and there are different camps to this debate. There are different people belonging to different camps. Whether the author is important for a literary text, or is the text independent of the author? So this is another question that literary criticism asks over a period of time. The third question is, what is the relationship between one literary text and another literary text? So are literary texts of a certain historical period connected to each other? Just to give you an example, so let's say if we say novel in the 19th century England. So there are different kinds of novels getting written. So we know that there is Charles Dickens, there is William Makepeace Thackeray, there's Charlotte Bronte, there is Jane Austen. So are these novels kind of borrowing from each other? Are these novels influencing each other? Do these novels have a relationship to each other? Or are they different? Are they independent in themselves? So the relationship between different kinds of literary texts is something that literary criticism also looks into. So what is the kind of relationship that exists between different sorts of literary texts? I gave you the example of novels, but I can always take, for example, what is the relationship between novels written in 19th century England with plays written in 19th century England, or other kinds of poetry, or other kinds of non-fiction written in 19th century England. So, is it possible to study literary texts in comparison to each other, but also as a comparative to each other, as something that kind of influence and counter influence each other? So, that is another thing that literary criticism throughout its history looks into. The most important question is the fourth one, where the question is, what are the different kinds of strategies or modes that literary criticism employs? Now, what I mean by modes or strategies is, let's say, does an author follow a certain kind of a style? Okay? So we can do a stylistic analysis of a literary text. So we need to find out what the style of, let's say, Shakespeare is, how does he write, and once we identify the specific nature of style that Shakespeare employs, then any text that we look at can be seen as we just follow the style of that text, and then we simply say it is written by Shakespeare. So even if someone tells us that I'm giving you this book and I'll not tell you who the author is, but if I know the style of the author, then I'll be able to identify that book because I know the style and say that this book was written by this author, etc. So, this is one of the things that literary criticism also looks at. So, style is just one example, but there are different other kinds of things that all literary texts do. For example, what does poetry do? So, you have rhyme, rhythm, the figures of speech. So, there are different aspects that make literature literature. And one of the studies that literary criticism does is to understand the different modes or the different strategies that literature employs to make it literature. Okay, so there are different ways that the literary text makes itself available, makes itself presentable to the world as a literary text. The last question is, as we discussed in literary criticism, what is the relationship between a literary text and the society that surrounds it and the history that surrounds it? So, what we need to do is, of course, that a literary text needs to be understood within the social and the historical parameters. So, literary criticism also looks into this. If we understand this, then we also need to understand that there are also debates. So remember that history of any history is also full of debates. Some people say something, some people say some other things. So we'll very quickly look at the major debates that happens in Western literary criticism. I am sure that as you do this course, you will look at some of these debates. When you look at individual literary critics or individual authors, then you will obviously look at some of these debates that have happened over a period of time. Now, one of the earliest debates that happened, of course, is this famous question of mimesis. So, mimesis, very loosely translated, means representation or imitation. And this was a debate that happened for many times, and sometimes people say this was the original debate that produced literary criticism in the West. And this debate went on for almost 1,000 years. So, you have the debate began with Plato and Aristotle, and it went on for almost 1,000 years. So, till about the beginning of the 20th century, this debate was not resolved. So, what is the basic core of this debate? The basic core of this debate is, how does literature represent reality? Okay. So, Plato will say that literature is a false representation or a false imitation of reality, while people like Aristotle would say it's not a false imitation at all, it is a representation. It is a representation of an ideal world. Okay, so literature actually improves the world rather than destroys or falsely represents the world. Okay, so this is one debate in literary criticism, and I'm sure that you will enjoy this debate when you study Plato and Aristotle. The second debate that is kind of animates literary criticism is this question of style. So, what do we understand by style in literature? So, if we say that there is a literary text and there is a certain kind of a style that is involved in it, then what do we mean by that style? And there are again different sorts of people talking about different kinds of things. So, what is a literary style? What makes literature literature? So, one of the examples that you see in early times, Horace, for example, who is 2nd century AD, almost 2000 years back, Horace says that the important part of literature is what he calls decorum. So, decorum is balance. So, you balance different, so you cannot exaggerate. You should not be exaggerating. There should be a constant balance between one kind of style and another kind of style, one kind of subject matter with another kind of subject matter, etc. So, you cannot have literature which produces excesses. So, if you have a lot of excess in literature, then it is not literature. That's what Horace says. So, decorum is the soul of literature, that he says. But then, of course, there are other people who say that that is not what literature is. Literature is about powerful feelings, it is about powerful emotions, it is about excesses. It is about something that spills over, that cannot be contained within decorum, that cannot be contained within modest balances. So what you do is you need to express yourselves. You need to constantly say things that cannot be said, or that will not be said, or that are not said. So that is more important in literature. So again, you have this debate of what should be the core of style of literature. The third one is, of course, what is the value of literature? There are lots of debates on this. So does literature have any value at all? Can it change society? Can it help people become rich, etc., etc.? Sometimes, yes, it can make you rich. If you write a novel and get a lot of money out of it, you can become rich. But the question is not that, whether you have become rich as an author or not, but can it change? Can it have an effect on the world outside? And this debate begins somewhere around the 12th and the 13th century. And a good example of this is Philip Sidney, which you're going to look at as you do this course. Because one of the things that Sidney talks about is that literature has the capability of making the world better. Okay? So that aspect of literature which has an effect on the world. So literature is not something self-contained. Literature is something that can be produced not only as a self-contained world, but also as something that can have an effect on the world. Okay. So, and of course, the debate is an older one, because Aristotle, for example, talks about catharsis, the effect that literature has. It makes you feel better, it purges you of different emotions and feelings, etc. But Aristotle talks about individual effects, while the later writers, later critics would talk about historical effects, social effects, etc. So this is another point that literary criticism talks about. Of course, when you're talking about literary criticism, we also talk about which literature is better. Okay, so what is the nature of literature? So is English literature better? Is French literature better? Is ancient literature better? Or is contemporary literature better? So all these debates also are a part of literary criticism. A good example of this in English literary criticism, of course, is Dryden, who wrote a famous book. Again, you're going to have a look at it, called Essay of Dramatic Poesy, where he talks about these debates. So he actually places the debate within national literatures. So is English literature better than French literature? That is one debate that happens in this book. But also, what is the distinction between ancient literature and modern literature? So when we say ancient literature, that's the literature of the Greeks, the Latin, Roman literature, etc. And is that better, or is modern literature better? So what we do is, in literary criticism, at least in the Western literary criticism, for a very long time, this debate happened over a period of time. The fifth point, of course, is literature universal, or is it contained by the social and historical forces of a particular time? So can I say that Shakespeare is universal? Can I say that Milton is universal? Can I say that Wordsworth and Coleridge are universal? Or do we have to study them simply as English writers, or English writers of a certain historical or a social stage, etc.? And a German writer called Goethe came up with this idea of world literature. So, where he says that instead of talking about literature only in terms of national boundaries or historical boundaries, we should talk about world literature. And then again, there is a long debate in literary criticism about, is there something called world literature? Can there be something called world literature? Because world literature assumes that there is something called universality, and though literature is produced within a particular history and a particular social context. So, how do we study world literatures, etc.? So, there's again a long debate. And as I said earlier, the last point on the slide is the effect of literature. So, what effect does literature have on individuals, on communities, on societies, and on histories? So, that again is a big debate, a big question that literary criticism in the West tries to address over a period of time. Uh, Another interesting debate that happens is the debate of the place of the author. So, how important is the author in in writing a text? So, is author absolutely important, completely in control, or is the literary text independent of the author? And this debate, for example, is available with Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth, for example, says that a poet writes under the influence of powerful feelings and emotions, and of course, through recollections and tranquility. Um, Coleridge also talks about the primary imagination and the secondary imagination of the poet. So, for both of them, the author is an important figure in the creation of a literary text. There are many other critics who would disagree with them, who would say that the author is, of course, important, but it is more important to understand the text in terms of what it does, what what it contains, rather than what the author is doing to the text, because there is no way that we can read a text and go back to the mind of the author. So we cannot really find out what was going on in the mind of the author when the author was writing the text. So, how do we understand what the author was thinking? So, the only way we can understand a text is by looking at it as it is present before us. So, this is another stream of debate or question that literary criticism asks in the West. Most importantly, of course, what are the criteria to judge literature? So, how do we judge literature? And there are different kinds of criteria that is given. We can begin with Plato and Aristotle. Uh, but in the 19th century, of course, Matthew Arnold, for example, talked about what he called the touchstone method of judging literature. So, what is the touchstone method? It is a method where he said that you can take the best of literature and then compare books or writings or texts that are produced now with that best. So, if you have a comparative model where you know that this literature has survived over time, it is historically available, it is considered to be the best by many critics, you take them as touchstones, you take them as benchmarks, and those benchmarks can then be employed to judge what is happening in contemporary recent times. Okay, so again, one of the things that one of the questions that literary criticism talks about during this period. Of course, the question of gender is important in literary criticism because do one of the questions that, for example, starts emerging around the 18th and 19th century is, uh, do women write differently? So, is there a different kind of a writing called women's writing? Do they talk about different things? Do they express themselves differently? Is there a different style of women's writing, etc.? So, all these questions become important if you look at literature as gendered. So, men producing literature and women producing literature are two different experiences, and they talk about two different experiences, and therefore should be studied differently. And some of the debates, of course, are contained in 19th century writings of Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein. Um, and she brings in these debates about what is the role of women in producing a literary text, for example, or what is the role of women generally within the creative impulse. So, what is the role of women in producing creative texts, etc. Or more recently, at the beginning of the 20th century, we have Virginia Woolf, which talks about women's writing, which talks about how women write, etc., and places it against men's writing. So, again, a debate that has started taking a different kind of a shape in recent times, but can be traced back to early forms of literary criticism that was happening in the 19th and the 20th century. And of course, the final thing is that literature as text and nothing outside the text is something that we have talked about. So, do we understand literature simply as a book? So, we understand the book, we do literary criticism of the book, or do we have to understand literature as something which is related to society, related to history, related to its author? So, do we do a criticism which is only text based? So, we just try to understand the text and nothing else? Or do we understand literary text as something that is connected constantly with the history, the society, the things that surround the text, etc.? Now, this again is a big debate, and I'm sure that you will look at those debates when you study the new critics, which began writing at the beginning of the 20th century. And these new critics assumed that there is nothing outside the literary text. So you don't really look at the author, you don't really look at history, or don't really look at society, because literary text has to be understood as a self-contained world. So you really cannot compare it with other things that is happening outside the text. So in conclusion, what we need to keep in mind when we are doing this course is the field of literary criticism itself needs to be seen within its historical perspective. So we need to understand, when we are looking at specific authors, or we are looking at specific literary critics, we need to understand that literary criticism itself is historical. Okay, so there are different kinds of things happening within literary criticism as it progresses. And it will be a good idea to keep in mind or keep a track of those changes that is happening in literary criticism as we progress. There are different kinds of debates and different kinds of socio-historical eras, so it will be also a good thing to keep in mind as a socio-historical continuation. Okay. And finally, of course, what we also need to understand is that when we look at literary criticism, then we need to it becomes much more specialized as we progress through history. It becomes much more, it's not simply a general understanding of literature, but also a general, very specific understandings of literature for very specific aspects of literature. And that is what literary criticism does. So I hope you enjoy the course, and thank you very much.